Well, it's 9 o'clock. Shall we?
Good morning, colleagues. Can you hear us from New York?
Yes.
Great. Just on the administrative side, 2 announcements. We're going to be starting in the next couple of seconds. And just for you to know that the presentation and the recording are going to be available to everyone who's participating in this meeting. The recording will be available approximately 24 to 48 hours after the meeting. And we'll distribute the link through the various channels via which we received a notification of this meeting. So the various listservs and also email addresses that we have. And secondly, we're going to request that everyone mutes themselves so that we can only have one center of control. And also, for any questions that you might have, please utilize the side chat bar to the left-hand side of your screen. Any questions, we'll keep track of them using the chat bar. So please use that if you have got any questions that you'd want to pose. And in terms of structure, in a few minutes, I will hand over control to Colin to start us off with a brief introduction of why we are here, and we'll be presenting, and then thereafter Michael will present, and we will have 2 slots for questions and answers. The first session, you'll be notified when we are open for answers, and then thereafter, at the end, our colleague Scott will try to bring things together by presenting to us the key themes that have emerged from the presentation, and we'll have another round of Q&A. So that's it in terms of the structure, and I'll hand over to Colin to start us off. Thank you.
Great, thanks a lot, Lovemore. Let me just introduce Lovemore, who was speaking to you just now. Lovemore is in the UNICEF Evaluation Office. He's our knowledge management specialist. So big thanks to you for getting us on the straight and narrow, Lovemore. Thanks. I'm delighted to see everybody online today. I would say good morning, but I see in Indonesia it's already nighttime. So good day to everybody. Good day, and I would say good night, but then you might think I'm logging out. So hello everybody. Big warm welcome to this rather extraordinary webinar. It brings together our colleagues around the EVALSDG network, also many of our colleagues around UNICEF. I see we have as many as 137 participants already. So a warm welcome to all of you. Let me introduce our principal speaker today, Michael Bamberger. Michael is known to many of you, I think, most of you, I'm sure. Michael has a very long history in development evaluation. I'm told as long as 50 years, which probably is a bit of a record. Michael spent many years in the World Bank, but since retiring from the bank, he has been a very active consultant, independent researcher, and author. And some of you, I'm sure, will be familiar with some of Michael's publications. Probably the most familiar one to many of us would be real-world evaluation, working under budget, time, data, and political constraints, which is now in its 2nd edition. But today, Michael will be talking about evaluation and the SDGs, and let me just mention another publication which Michael co-authored, along with Marco Sigone and Florentia Tatiosian, called Evaluating the Sustainable Development Goals with a No One Left Behind lens through equity-focused and gender-responsive evaluations. There, that gets the prize for the longest title of today. So, prolific writer and a grand authority on evaluation. And Michael's keeping a keen eye on emerging issues in evaluation. He's been writing recently about big data and evaluation. He's been writing about complexity and evaluation. And I'm sure we'll touch on some of these issues this morning. As Lovemore mentioned, we'll also hear in the course of the morning from Scott Chaplow. And Scott works at the International Federation of the Red Cross on monitoring and evaluation, and has a long history with the Red Cross, been there for at least 10 years, and is also a published author, has recently published with Brad Cousins a book on monitoring and evaluation training. So I'm sure we might hear a little more about that aspect of Scott's work in due course. So a warm welcome to everybody, a warm welcome to Scott, and indeed a very warm welcome to Michael. Let me just say before Michael starts that we'll take this in two pieces. Here, just to indicate that they can hear. It seems that we've lost the sound. What's
yes, now they can hear. Now everybody says yes.
Now,
no sound.
Okay, all right. Okay, sorry you missed my long introduction. I won't do it again. Let me just say we're very pleased to have Michael Bamberger with us this morning, and Michael will be talking to us now about evaluation and the SDGs. So Michael, over to you.
So thank you. So hello everybody. It's a good evening for some people and good morning for others. It's a pleasure to have so many of you with us. So what I'm going to try to do in the time we have available, in the first part of the presentation, I'm going to try and present a framework of what is special about the evaluation of the SDGs, what are some of the particular challenges, and some of the special opportunities. We'll then have some questions, and then I will talk briefly about 10 promising new evaluation approaches to the SDGs, which obviously we'll have to just go through very, very quickly. So the first part is presenting a framework, have some questions, and then the second part will be describing briefly some of the methods. And at the end of the presentation, there's some resource publications which describe in more detail the different methods. So this is the plan. So next. Do a very systematic and rigorous analysis of what has been achieved, who's benefited, who hasn't. And it's particularly critical to make sure that the investments reach and benefit the poorest groups, because sometimes people say the programs were a success, more schools, more people have access to health, but they forget that sometimes some of the poorest, most vulnerable, voiceless people are not benefiting. So we really need to focus on that, and we hope to learn some lessons about how development assistance can be improved during the period up to 2030 and after that. So this is a very critical commitment to evaluate the SDGs. And as you see when we'll go along, not everybody is focusing on evaluation. Many agencies are more concerned about monitoring, so I'm going to be emphasizing that it's absolutely essential to evaluate whether the programs achieve their long-term sustainable objectives, and not just have we built more schools and are more children getting vaccinated, although those are, of course, absolutely critical. So next, please. So some of the unique focus of the SDG evaluations, which many of you are familiar with. The first is a concept of universality. The SDGs apply to everybody in the world, not just to poor countries, not just to developing countries, but they address everybody in all countries. So it's a very broad focus. And there's a focus on sustainability of not just do things get implemented, but do they continue to operate, which is fairly new to the evaluation community. Not many evaluations focus on sustainability. And then there's the complementarities among all of the SDGs. There's many different sectors being covered, many different levels, and the SDGs hope to be having an integrated approach, not just looking at one SDG after another separately, which is one of the big criticisms of the MDGs, that there was this silo mentality. The people working on transport only wanted to know about the transport outcomes. They weren't concerned about gender or health or education. So the SDGs are putting a focus on trying to understand the complementarities. They're also beginning to talk about a systems approach, understanding how the whole of the SDG delivery and planning system operates, the linkages between the different agencies at different levels, in different countries, in different technical areas. And so this is something, again, which is fairly new to evaluations. And then gender and equity are central cross-cutting themes, which again, compared with the MDGs, there was a separate MDG on gender. Now they're trying to make this equity and gender central themes covering everything. That's a challenge, as we'll see as we go along. Then also, the evaluation is trying to focus on the underlying causes of inequality, not just measuring targets, but understanding who gets excluded and, perhaps more important, why they get excluded. So that is a critical focus. And a strong emphasis on participatory approaches, giving voice to vulnerable groups. It's not just asking what the Minister of Health thinks or what UNICEF thinks, but what do the poor people who are normally voiceless and nobody listens to, what do they think? And then finally, there's a focus on inclusion, equity, and social justice. And so this is a very strong guiding principle. And so these are some of the unique focuses of the SDG evaluation, all critical, all quite challenging. So next, please. So some of the special challenges for the evaluations. Don't get too discouraged. Later we'll be talking about there are some exciting new approaches for addressing these challenges. But just to begin with some of the things which we're facing, which are pretty unique to the evaluation community. Firstly, the programs are huge and complex. There's multiple actors, multiple objectives working at multiple levels, from the regional, the country, right down to what is happening in small villages. So this is a real challenge, which I don't think the evaluation community has addressed anything on this magnitude before. And one big issue is the SDGs talk about evaluation. If you look at the design they're actually using, there's much more focus on monitoring. All of the 170 or whatever it is indicators, they're almost all monitoring indicators. Very little focus on evaluation. So it's going to be a real challenge to get people from moving from monitoring what they've delivered to evaluating what effects it's had. And many people in the SDG community don't believe it is possible to evaluate. They say, no, it's so complicated, we really can't do it. Let's just focus on monitoring. So, which I think would be an incredible tragedy if we spend billions of dollars over 15 years' time. At the end, people say, we really don't know what it's achieved, it's too complicated, but we can tell you how many things we built. So that's a real challenge. Most agencies focus on a particular sector: transport, health, education, agriculture. And so the concept of intersectorality looking at the linkages between different sectors. How does building roads affect health or access to education is going to be a big challenge. And unfortunately, most agencies, it's a very low priority. You want to know, did your roads get built? Not a particular concern necessarily. Did it have an effect on health? So getting people to move out of evaluating their particular sector to looking at the linkages is a challenge methodologically, but it's also a challenge politically. And then if you look at the design of the SDGs, it's top-down, designed in New York and the regions of the world. A lot of people got together and developed a set of performance indicators, and these then go down to country governments and intended to combine with a bottom-up consultation. So is this really happening? Is there really a bottom-up consultation, or is this rhetoric? So this is one of the challenges. Everybody talks a good game about giving voice, listening to people in the villages. If we look at how the SDG evaluations are actually taking place, how much influence power is given to the bottom-up focus, as opposed to the very complicated, well-organized meetings which take place at higher levels. So some challenges there. All of these are ways to resolve them, but it's important for people to be aware that these are issues which need to be addressed. Next, please. Then the question, can all these different kinds of organizations actually work together in an integrated evaluation? Hasn't been done very often in the past. Can it be done this time? Looking at vulnerability and exclusion, these are difficult to measure and not very well addressed in a lot of the evaluation literature. And sustainability, we're talking about sustainable development goals. There's very little good evaluation literature on how to measure sustainability. So that's going to be a challenge. Gender analysis is something that we know a great deal about, but at the moment it's not very well integrated into most evaluations, as many of our friends listening today will know. So we have the tools, the techniques. Do we have the will? Do we have the organizational structures to do that? And then finally, the challenge is we need to have stronger learning mechanisms. One of the big challenges, weaknesses of any kind of evaluation is the results tend not to get well disseminated. People tend not to draw lessons. They don't tend to take action on what was learned in the evaluation. So this is going to be a challenge. So next, please. So just to summarize what is the SDG evaluation lens, these are a few of the critical areas which are quite new to evaluation that the evaluations will be focusing on. Firstly, looking at the context and the history. How programs evolve in the future depends on how they evolved in the past, what people's experience has been with previous similar programs. So that's important. Complexity is a big challenge. Programs don't operate in isolation. They're influenced by the local, economic, political, cultural, demographic environment in which they operate. And related to that, a really big challenge is emergence. Programs constantly change. Evaluation designs don't usually. Evaluation designs tend to be fairly rigid and don't have flexibility to adapt very well to changing programs. So looking at emergence is a big challenge. Exclusion and social control are, again, relatively new to the evaluation field. We need to look at those. We've talked about intersectionality. I mentioned emergence again, that's very critical. Trajectories of change, I'll be talking about understanding what is the pattern of change, over what periods of time do we expect the changes to take place. And we'll see that many evaluations ignore thinking about the trajectory of when changes are likely to happen. Many evaluations take place years before you could expect any changes. So focusing on the trajectories is important. Then sustainability and resilience, again, are something which aren't very well addressed in evaluations, are going to be big challenges. Then finally, causality, looking at attribution and contribution. What difference has the program actually made? And as we mentioned earlier, a lot of people say that's too difficult, let's forget about that. and we'll just do monitoring, which we know how to do quite well. So next, please. So the question, does the evaluation community have the tools to address these broad and complex questions? We'll be coming back to that, but I look forward to listening to your comments in the discussion in a few minutes. So next, please. So just to finish this introduction, the SDG framework has a lot of challenges. It also offers some unique opportunities for innovative evaluations. It's focusing on these very broad questions which many evaluations don't tend to try to tackle. It's asking what works for whom, where, why, how. So it's a very exciting opportunity to really focus on these questions which the SDG is discussing. Brings together many different kinds of organizations and talents, a resource potential you very rarely see. Difficult to bring everybody together, but it's very exciting opportunities. And if the SDGs work well, it will be giving voice to vulnerable groups and grassroots organizations who are supposed to be significant actors in this endeavor. And finally, it has a unique access, offers a unique access to worldwide platforms for dissemination, utilization of the evaluation findings. There's a tremendous potential, will, the resources, if these can all be brought together. So next, please. So I'll stop there. So just giving a very brief framework why we need to think about the evaluation of the SDGs, some of the challenges, some of the new issues and areas that the SDGs are focusing on, some of the unique opportunities, and then a lens of the new areas that we need to be looking at. So we'll take some questions now, and then in the second part, I'll go through very briefly some of the exciting new evaluation tools and methods which are becoming available. So thank you, and over to you.
Great, thanks, Michael. And I think you've outlined very clearly the scale of the challenge and the opportunities as well, I think, for evaluation as we try to engage with this very big agenda, this very ambitious agenda around the SDGs. So let me open it up for questions. Type your question in the sidebar, and we'll take 2 or 3 and put them to Michael, and he'll respond. We'll spend a few minutes on this because there's another part to the presentation. So Ranto is asking whether we have a presentation on the methodology. That's coming up, so stay with us, Ranto, and we'll get onto that in just a few minutes. So we've got a number of questions coming up. By the way, for those who are having difficulty hearing, see if you can get a better connection. Try and get a hard wired connection rather than a Wi-Fi connection, if you possibly can. I know some of you are having difficulty with the audio. Okay, let's take a few questions then. And first question, Michael, to what extent will the SDGs be relying on real data? I think that means real-time data from all over the world for its indicators. So that's really a monitoring question, but it has an evaluation dimension to it. Susan Durston, hi Susan. Issues such as sustainability will need to be seen differently in different contexts, especially in the context of conflict. How do you see that? So conflict and sustainability, big issue. And remember, one of the SDGs is particularly concerned with peace and difficult contexts. A question for UNICEF. Would you suggest, well, a question for Michael for UNICEF. Would you suggest that UNICEF influences governments to conduct SDG nationwide evaluations? How would you react to that, Michael? And Musarat, thanks. You're as optimistic as ever. Please let us focus on opportunities, Musarat says, as everyone else is already talking about challenges. So let's accentuate the positive, as they say. Let's take just one more question and then turn back to Michael. Is it right to say that evaluation of SDGs is, in summary, a systematic measure of good governance and social justice in development practice? So is it only about good governance and social justice, or is it about more? Actually, here's a related question, so let's make this the last one before we turn to Michael. Sorry to bombard you, Michael. Given the interconnectedness of the SDGs, to have an evaluation framework in the absence of an overall evaluation framework, indicator, SOPs, and methodologies may be challenging. I think that's the nature of the question there. So Michael, we'll take a few more questions in a minute, but Michael, what do you make of in response to those questions?
Thank you. They're very challenging questions, and everybody's been thinking a great deal about these issues. So I'll just try to respond very briefly to these. The kinds of data which the evaluation is going to rely on is going to be a big challenge of who is going to be able to generate data. There's a risk that all of the data will just come from national monitoring systems and will not get into any of these broader issues. So the big challenge is how well will local level organizations, civil society, different kinds of organizations which have the capacity to dig deeper, to what extent will they be involved in designing and contributing to the SDGs? That is going to vary a great deal, as we all know, from country to country and sector to sector. And so I think a big challenge is to make sure that broad inclusion of different agencies is really a goal and not just rhetoric. Everybody talks about bottom-up evaluations. Is this going to happen? So there isn't any magical formula for that, but it's partly a question of the civil society and a range of organizations getting themselves organized to pressure, but also support from the international agencies to encourage governments to listen to some of these voices. If we had more time, perhaps another occasion, we can talk about some of your experiences in how to do that. But it's going to be a challenge, and one of the big things is just making sure this stays on the radar screen of having ways to generate the kinds of data which are available. In every country, there are people who know these kinds of things, they know how to do these studies. Will they get incorporated? Jumping on to sustainability. Sustainability, what you mean by sustainability varies project by project, sector by sector, country by country. So there isn't a magical definition of sustainability as these 5 things. So you have to think, what is a program trying to do? How would you know if it's continuing to do this over time? What does sustainability mean in a conflict situation where the population you're working with may be constantly moving, too fearful to ask any questions, to give any information? I think people know what are the kind of sustainability questions you'd like to ask. The main point is sustainability rarely gets built into an evaluation. So we have to make a commitment to thinking 5 years from now, how would we know if the program is going well? Is it continuing to achieve its objectives? And many people shrug their shoulders and say, really great to do this, but we don't have the time or the resources, so let's just monitor whether we've built the schools. So it's a question of a commitment and then coming up with a sort of framework of what are the things you'd like to look. And just one key thing is having a mechanism so you can actually collect information over the next 5 years or 10 years. What tends to happen is people say they're doing a sustainability analysis, but they do it now projecting into the future. They say, let's assume that government continues to provide resources. Let's assume that there isn't a drought. Let's assume, and if all those things happen, our program will be sustainable. And that's what some people call a sustainability analysis, and it's not. You have to actually be able to collect data in the future to see whether these things have actually happened. Rarely done. People say, well, it's too complicated. Our budget doesn't continue, so you have to find, it's absolutely critical to find ways how you can look at in real time. So what would be the role of UNICEF and other agencies in encouraging the governments to come up with a more responsive evaluation framework? It's a difficult question. One doesn't want to be pushing governments too much so that they're just responding to the international agenda, but in some cases this can be helpful. And so an organization like UNICEF might want to have a sort of checklist of some of the minimum things that it thinks should be built into all of the evaluations, one of which might be making sure you're giving voice to poor and vulnerable groups, and then trying to find tactful ways of helping government and other agencies to do this. I think we're all familiar with the challenges and the different ways that this can be done. So there's a balance. It's not a UNICEF or World Bank evaluation, but they are all critical partners. Focusing on opportunities, this is absolutely critical. I mentioned a few of the opportunities which exist, and we'll be talking about some of the methods. So the opportunities are there, and I think it's really critical that early on in the SDG evaluations, you start showing some positive results so that people see you can come up with interesting results. If you just say, wait for 5 years till we finish this rigorous evaluation, everybody will have forgotten about the evaluation. So coming up with some immediate results to make people see that new things are being found out. What is the role of the evaluation in looking at governance? The evaluations are looking at a whole range of things. Governance is one of them, ability to deliver services, response to services. There's a whole range of different things at different levels which have to be addressed, and clearly governance is one of them. It's not the only one, but it's going to be a big challenge of prioritizing to try to be covering all of the different critical issues. Then the question of methodology. Do we have to begin by developing a national methodology before we can work more at the local levels? There's a danger of saying everybody has to wait until the government and the international agencies have come up with a national methodology. You should be encouraging local agencies to start today doing evaluations at their levels, and very often they're going to be producing results much more quickly than the governments and the national level agencies. So don't just sit and wait for a national evaluation framework. It may never come in some countries. So everybody has a role to play in this. If you're in the education sector and you have a way of moving ahead with your evaluations, do that and then build it into a national evaluation if and when it occurs. So those are just a few very, very quick thoughts on some very challenging questions.
Great, thanks, Michael. Let's just take a couple more questions. There seem to be several which are asking about the program cycle and the way in which evaluation fits into the program cycle. So thinking about the relationship then between planning, monitoring, and evaluation. So one question is, for example, asking about systematic monitoring as being essential for better evaluation. How do we address that challenge? There's another question which was asking about the linkage, the implications for evaluation in relation to the project cycle. And related to that, there's a question about post-project evaluation. How do we deal with that, given that sometimes programs end and the funds aren't available for evaluation at a later stage. Then there's a second set of questions, Michael, which are really about context. How do we contextualize evaluations adequately? And the flip side of that is, how do we aggregate so that we get a global picture, given that local context can be so very, very different? So I've taken a few of the different questions there, tried to bundle them into two sets of questions there. So briefly, Michael, back to you, and then we'll get on to the methodology part.
Okay, well, thank you. These, again, are all very challenging questions, so just a few brief thoughts. Talking about the project cycle, the SDGs are not evaluating projects. They're evaluating sectoral impacts, national impacts, linkages between sectors, asking questions like, are there complementarities between different sectors? Is there a value added of doing an intersectoral evaluation, or does it just make it more complicated and not really produce better answers? So we have to obviously draw on project cycle information if it's available, but it's a very different approach if we're evaluating the SDGs than if we're evaluating a particular project. So just one point related to that. A critical thing is to make sure you're asking the right questions at the beginning, which is very often not done. Many people, as soon as you say we're going to do an evaluation, they all start arguing about should we use randomized controlled trials or focus groups. And I've seen many evaluations, nobody has ever really sat down and thought, what are the questions that we want to address? So begin with the questions. Some of them are very, very broad. Some of them are going to be very difficult to answer. But you can't just say, let's forget about intersectorality because it's difficult. Let's just see if our project has delivered its services. So however tough the questions, identify them, and then start thinking what are the methods. And there's never going to be any one method. You have to have complementary methods to address these questions. So that's not an answer, but it's an important focus. Context is critical, and it's always difficult to address. But for any evaluation you're doing, even if it's just qualitative description, you have to try to understand the context in which the program is operating. The historical context, is there a civil war going on? Is there a drought? What is happening to the economy? Maybe you have an unstable government. All of these things affect your program, so somebody has to be looking at the contextual variables. Sometimes it may just be a rapid descriptive study. Sometimes I'll be talking later about some of the things you can do with data, how you can start collecting contextual data. It's essential, and always remembering that context includes as well history. Many people assume this is the first time in a particular country anybody's ever done a health program. And maybe there have been 10 health programs, they've all gone badly. And so when you come, this is a new exciting thing, everybody should get involved and say, well, we remember 2 years ago that something similar didn't work. So understand the history of the programs, of the way that maybe the population of the city has doubled over the last 5 years. All of these things are really critical and tend to get ignored. So context is critical, need to focus on it. Aggregating all of the different evaluation results is a challenge. You really ideally want some kind of theoretical framework of what the SDGs are supposed to be doing at the national level, and then the different pieces you can build in to try to fill up the different boxes. Not a very adequate answer, but I'm afraid that's all there's time for at the moment. But these are all things we'll be coming back to time and time again, and people listening to this, you've all got the answers to these questions when you put your heads together. So,
great, thanks, Michael. And I think you're challenging us now to really do some thinking about the relationship between the micro and the macro, towards whether we should be opportunistic or whether we should be carefully planning. And of course, perhaps we need to be all of these things in different places and in different ways. So Michael raised the question of methodology, but he insisted that the first thing to do is to have good questions, good evaluation questions. Evaluation is always about asking questions and hopefully getting to a better question through the evaluation process. So let's turn now to the second part of the presentation, and we'll ask Michael to take us through a number of methodological options. Just to say before we start, thank you very much for all the questions and comments. We don't have time to go through all of them now, but I think through the EVALSDGs network, we should be able, I think, to zoom in on some of these questions in future webinars. So big thanks for all the contributions, which are flooding in literally as we speak. So Michael, back to you for the methodological part of the presentation.
Next, please. Okay, so I have listed on this slide and the next one 10 promising approaches, and I have a one-page note on each of these approaches, which I'll try to go through as much as I can in about 15, 16 minutes. At the end of the paper, there are some resource documents which go into more detail on these approaches. So can we have the jump 2 slides? The next one, please. Sorry, the next, I forgot that one to say. Okay, so I'm going to talk very briefly about 10 promising approaches, many of which you're familiar with. And so I'm not going to explain the approaches, but just flag a few of their potential uses. So mixed methods and multiple methods we're all familiar with. This combines data collection and analysis methods across and also within disciplines. It combines quantitative and qualitative methods, but it also combines different quantitative methods and different qualitative methods. So it's bringing together a range of different methods to strengthen the basis you have for your evaluation. Mixed methods help understand behavioral change, what actually happens during project implementation, social control mechanisms, why is it that excluded groups continue to be excluded. It's not just a magical thing. There are systematic social control processes which keep women from access to labor markets, which keep ethnic minorities from access to education, for example. So mixed methods helps us to look at some of these more complicated, difficult to measure aspects. Triangulation, where we systematically combine different methods, is a very valuable tool for strengthening the validity of data and the interpretation. Many evaluations talk about they're going to use triangulation. Very few of them actually get down to doing it. So it's something you have to mention on page 1, but if you look at evaluations, often they don't do it very systematically. It has to be planned, integrated into the evaluation. Then to get the full benefits of a mixed method approach, you have to have a systematic approach where you're systematically combining quantitative and qualitative methods at each stage of the evaluation. It's an integrated approach to evaluation. It isn't just ad hoc conducting a survey and then doing a few focus groups which are not systematically related. So this is a challenge. Mixed methods is an integrated approach, which is not how it's used in a lot of cases. It has a tremendous potential, has to be one of the central tools of the evaluation. Next, please. We all use theory of change or other kinds of theory-based evaluation approaches. Very powerful tools. These provide a framework for identifying the questions that you're looking at, for understanding the processes you're trying to assess, and for identifying the hypotheses that you want to examine. So it's a very powerful tool, a theory of change. And it helps to describe in more detail the processes through which changes are supposed to be taking place so that you can sort of test whether these have actually happened. The weakness of most theories of change is they don't include a rival hypothesis. They just describe how they think the changes are going to occur. These changes happen, so you say, voila, our program's been a success. It may very well be that all of the changes are due to other factors, like an improvement in the economy, which you haven't tested. So a theory of change needs to include at least one rival hypothesis. Very few do. Most theories of change also tend to be static. You assume that the program doesn't change in its design from day one until 5 years later when it ends. And they're not very good at studying emergence or complexity. So you have to find ways of getting more flexible, dynamic theories of change. And it's also important to build in potential unintended outcomes. I'll come back to this a little bit later. Many theories of change, the client just says, please describe how our program's supposed to work, and you don't look at any unintended outcomes. So critical that theory of change doesn't just look at your results framework, it looks at all of the other changes which are taking place and need to include the contextual variables which we've talked about earlier. So next, please. Some exciting new approaches to case studies. Case studies are a very powerful tool for understanding the lived experiences of different groups and for digging deeper into understanding how people think about the program, how they experience the different kind of changes which are taking place. It's important to ensure cases are selected to be representative. There's a common weakness that cases are selected in a rather ad hoc way, and it's very difficult to know how you generalize from them. Particularly if you're combining them with survey data, are they comparable? If you get different results coming from the case studies, is this because you've discovered new things, or is it because the case studies are sampling a different universe? Then it's also very important to have more rigor in how cases are analyzed. A lot of people do what they call cherry picking. You look through the cases, you find a few quotes which support your theory, and don't do very rigorous evaluation. Somehow you forget to mention the cases which the program hasn't worked. So more systematic analysis of the cases, and ideally cases should be longitudinal, looking at how groups change over time and not just doing a single interview. Hard within budgets and time constraints, but you lose a great deal of the value of a case study if it's just based upon one interview. The whole logic of cases is trying to study processes and changes over time. Next is, I'll just mention very briefly a very interesting new development in the case studies of the Qualitative Comparative Analysis, QCA. Without going into the details, the QCA approach identifies a number of attributes of each case. The case could be an individual, a household, a community, schools, whatever your case, and you identify a number of attributes, important characteristics of the case, which you think will relate to outcomes, and then you have an indicator for outcomes. And normally you just have a dichotomous measure of yes, no, the outcome was achieved, it wasn't achieved, the parents have completed secondary education, they haven't completed secondary education. Then in the analysis, you identify the configuration, the set of outcomes, of attributes, characteristics of the cases which have to be present for the outcome to occur. And similarly, the set of attributes which, if they're present, the outcome doesn't occur. So it's a way of looking at sets of outcomes rather than just individual variables. And so this can also has the advantage of being able to be used with small samples, 50 or less cases. So QCA is looking on cases as subsystems, each of which is different, and you're trying to identify the patterns which of configurations which are related to outcomes. So this is very useful for analysis of complexity. Be happy to go into this in more detail if we have time. It's obviously quite a complicated subject, but it's becoming very important as a new form of causal analysis. So next, please. I'm sorry we're going through these very quickly, but I hope we can give just a little bit of a flavor. The evaluation field doesn't yet have an adequate way of evaluating complex programs, but there aren't any well-tested theories you can apply for evaluating complexity. A lot of the complexity literature is very hard to follow and technical and difficult to operationalize. I, with a couple of my co-authors, have been trying to come up with an approach where we break down complexity into 4 different dimensions, each of which can be studied individually. The nature of the intervention is the intervention itself complicated, complex, or relatively simple. The context in which it operates, you may have a fairly simple program, but it's operating in a very complex context with conflict, with a declining economy, with drought. So you need to look at the context. You also need to look at the interaction among different implementing agencies. Are they coordinating? Are they competing? Are they using the same criteria? Do the data, are they consistent with each other? So a lot of problems of complexity come from the different implementing agencies who are falling over each other's feet. So that's important. And then nonlinear causality. Simple models assume that change is linear and programs steadily improve over time. In fact, change is not linear. It goes forward, it goes backwards. A lot of gender work, for example, you have some initial improvements in women's empowerment, and then you get blowback. Men start feeling they're being threatened. You get increases in domestic violence, and you may, as the gender people say, 1 step forward, 2 steps back. So change isn't linear. So these are the 4 different dimensions you can look at of complexity, and then you have to pull it all together at the end with a complexity responsive framework. You can have many programs where each individual component works well. When you look at it within the complexity framework, you find that overall it hasn't achieved its goals. So this is one of many approaches of trying to come up with a real-world approach to complexity. So next, please. Trajectory analysis. Basically, Each program is producing outcomes over different time horizons and in different ways. Some programs, the outputs increase steadily. For example, if more farmers get fertilizer, the aggregate output goes up. If you're vaccinating more children, you get health benefits. So some programs, there's a steady increase in the outcomes. In others, outcomes improve steadily during the first years, and then you run into maintenance problems, and the outputs begin to decline, outcomes begin to decline. This is an example where you have a minor irrigation project, goes well when it's being supervised, the donors go away, you run into maintenance problems, and the outcomes begin to decline. Others, there's no regular pattern, it may be cyclical depending on the climate, on the economic conditions. So the message is it's really critical to try and think through what is the trajectory, the time period over which you think outcomes are going to be taking place, and when should you measure. The vast majority of evaluations are done too early because the donor says we need to have an evaluation by next year. If you just did on the back of a piece of paper a trajectory analysis, you could see there's no way in the world that by next year would you be achieving outcomes. But the donor says, sorry, this has to be done. Or the government says, you know, the wicked UNICEF is breathing down our neck, we have to have this thing. So if you start with a trajectory analysis, you can then go along to others saying the evaluation has to be done next year, and you can say that's great, but please realize you're not going to be able to measure any of the outcomes. So that's really critical, very rarely done. Very few people think about, is this the ideal time to do the evaluation? You do it now because somebody has said you have to do it now. Major problem. So try and think about trajectory analysis. So, next, please. I imagine everybody's getting quite dizzy by now and going off to get another cup of coffee to try and stop them getting confused. Gender responsive evaluation. This is a field where we have most of the tools and techniques. The challenge is they're not very widely implemented. They're not built into most evaluations. There are special gender evaluations, but for most evaluations, gender doesn't get very, very serious attention. So the challenge is how to build gender into evaluations as a systematic part and not just as an optional extra, which you do if a particular trust fund gives you a little bit of extra money. We know how to do this, but it's a big challenge implementing. At the end of the text, there's a few references on some of the resources. So next, please. Social exclusion analysis. Who is left behind? The SDGs talk a good game about we're going to be looking at who is left behind. Not quite clear yet whether they have the methodologies for doing this in many cases, but there's a lot of quantitative work has now been done on social exclusion analysis by organizations like UNICEF, the World Health Organization, FAO, and others, where basically you do a quantitative analysis to look at the interactions between ethnicity, where you live, age, gender, to see how these all interact to determine who is being excluded from different services. It may be if you're a girl from a particular ethnic group, you have more problems of exclusion from education when you're 8 years old. It may be if you're a boy from that same ethnic group, the problem comes at school when you're 12 years old. Understanding the linkages between these different variables is challenging. It can be done. The tools exist for doing this at the national level. You also need to strengthen the qualitative aspects of the ethnographic and other methods to dig deeper. One of the challenges of most social exclusion analysis is you just work with the data you've got available, and very often nobody looks at who is being excluded from the data. I was doing some work on the internally displaced population in Colombia. Many very rigorous studies have been done using the National Directory of the IDPs, the internally displaced population. We looked at this and we found 40% of all of the IDPs were not included in the register. I didn't see any study which had mentioned this. People had used randomized control trials and incredibly sophisticated statistics on a completely invalid database. Almost all sampling frames leave out people. The undocumented, people who are afraid to register, people who are going to informal schools which are not covered by the school directory. So it's really critical to dig deeper to understand who is being left out and why. These groups are very often invisible, and everyone says we've done a really great job of including more people in the school system. You don't realize there's 15-20% of the population are invisible. You don't even know they're there. So this is a big challenge, particularly for the SDGs. Next, please. Unintended outcomes and secondary and tertiary effects. Many evaluation designs, including what are considered very rigorous designs like the randomized controlled trials, are very good at measuring whether you've achieved intended outcomes. They're a disaster for looking at unintended outcomes. RCTs don't do this. They say that we've achieved what we intended to do. They have no idea that domestic violence has gone up as a result of your program. So it's absolutely essential to find a way of looking at unintended outcomes of programs. It can be done. It very rarely is. Many donors say, don't waste time and resources on things which we can't control. Just tell us whether more kids are going to our schools. So I know a lot of evaluators have been told, don't waste time looking at unintended outcomes, which I have views on that, which I won't mention at the moment. I'll just take 2 more minutes to skim through the last 2 points. So essential to look at unintended outcomes using qualitative methods, whatever seems appropriate. It's also important to look at what I call secondary outcomes, which are other effects on the target population which were not mentioned in the project design and which are often not studied. So that's important. And also tertiary outcomes, which are effects on other groups. So don't just measure, has your project achieved what's in the results framework? Look at other effects on positive and negative on the target population and on the broader population. So important, very often it's not getting done. Again, people say, you evaluators, you've got your heads in the clouds. It's difficult for us to do this. Let's just focus on our narrow objectives. The SDGs, it's going to be particularly important to have this sort of broader focus. So next, please. Some promising developments in systems analysis. Systems analysis tries to understand the interactions between all of the different parts of the system and all of the different actors and organizations that affect the outcomes. So it has different ways of trying to map the interactions between different agencies, the communication patterns, whether they're cooperating, whether they're in conflict, whether they're not in contact at all. And it tries to, there's a whole number of approaches for trying to model how these changes take place over time. Sociometric analysis, where you look at patterns of communication, power, friendship, is one of the many techniques, and be happy to come back to this in the discussions. So on to the final slide, please. So new information technology, the ICTs, big data, smart data analytics is beginning to offer a lot of very exciting tools which should be very important for the SDGs. Things like satellite images, remote sensors, analysis of social media like Twitter, analysis of electronic financial transactions, ATMs, audio, video images, phone and radio communications. These are all things which can very rapidly broaden the data that we can draw on for our evaluations. Lots of very exciting things going on. At the moment, evaluation offices are very far behind other kinds of agencies. Most evaluation offices don't make very systematic use of big data at this point. Other people do, like, for example, if you're working in emergency relief programs, you use a lot of big data. It's used for planning, for research, but the evaluators, for a number of reasons we could discuss later, tend not to be using these methods very much yet. It's going to be a real challenge. You have to find a way of doing these. And just on the final wrap-up slide, please. So what would a good SDG evaluation program look like in 2030? Some of the questions it will be trying to address. How have people's lives been affected by the SDGs? Very broad questions. We have to look at these. Was a massive investment of resources worthwhile? That's going to make a lot of people feel uncomfortable, but it's a critical question to ask. Who has benefited? Who has not? Who has been left behind? What lessons can we learn from multi-sectoral approaches? Is there value added of a multi-sectoral approach? Does it just make life more complicated without producing additional benefits? So these are just a few of the very broad questions that the SDGs will look at. So when we all meet together again in 2030, I hope we'll have answers to all of these questions. And so just the final wrap-up slide, please. Sorry, the next one. Those are some resources. So good luck with your SDG evaluations, and thank you.
Wonderful, thank you, Michael. You've taken us at a gallop across the evaluation landscape. Lots of things to think about. And indeed, we could have a webinar on each of the methodological approaches that you've outlined. But I think you've given us a menu, indeed, of things to consider. We haven't finished. I know we're time is marching on, but if you have some further questions for Michael, put them in the sidebar there. But what I'd like to do very quickly is turn to Scott Chaplow to just give a reaction to some of the issues, some of the many issues that Michael has touched on. So Michael, pardon me. So Scott, over to you.
Hi, can people hear me okay?
A very faint, Scott. Can you get nearer the mic?
Can you hear me?
We can hear you, but get close to the mic.
Is this better?
That's great. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. It's interesting because just this week, EVALSDGs released its 6th briefing paper in a series of briefing papers, and it's entitled Evaluation and Missed Opportunity in the SDGs. And this briefing paper, if you want to find it, is freely accessible on the internet. You can, it's a briefing paper that's been produced collaboratively by the International Institute for Environment and Development, IIED, with EVALSDGs and EVAL partners. Again, it's called Evaluation, a Missed Opportunity in SDGs. You can Google any of those terms and they'll take you to the IIED website, and you can also access the other briefing papers there. It's interesting because it looks at basically 22 pioneer countries that conducted voluntary national reviews, VNRs, to basically provide an up-to-date overview of the implementation of the process of the 2030 Agenda and provide some baseline facts and information about the status of the SDGs in each of the reporting countries. And what's interesting about it is I found myself taking some of the points that Michael teased out in his presentation, but also in his answers to the good questions that were raised, and looking at them in comparison with some of the findings of this briefing paper. For example, Michael pointed out early on and then reinforced it later in his presentation that currently the SDGs evaluation designs, if they exist, focus on monitoring and much less on evaluation, and they need to go beyond monitoring. And that was clearly one of the findings in this recent briefing paper that came out. To give you a quote from the briefing paper, there appears to be very little awareness about just what evaluation is and how it could be used to support the 2030 Agenda. For example, how it can help decision makers understand complex contexts, how it can support management that adapts to changing circumstances, and how it can strengthen the policy coherence between sectors and/or between actions undertaken by different types of stakeholders. And I think a lot of what Michael presented out on kind of highlights that. There are some considerable challenges with measuring the SDGs, and one that I often confront is, as Michael called out in his slide, many people do not believe it's possible to evaluate the SDGs. And I think I can understand where that's coming from, but I also believe we should not throw the baby out with the bathwater and discard our efforts to measure what difference we're making. Or another way of putting it, it might not be possible, recognizing the complexity that's out there and the limitations in measuring linear cause and effect, and as Michael pointed out, some of the quantitative approaches that have often been called the gold standard, but now some critics are calling the fool's gold standard, like randomly controlled trials and so forth. They still have their use, but the idea of ironclad proof is just an idea, and even though that proof might not always be obtainable, you can still collect awfully good evidence. And that's what I hear coming through in Michael's presentation. He outlined a variety of different methods in the latter part of the presentation. And I think a lot of it starts off with acknowledging he calls the stages of complexity, or simply the complex systems that we operate in. And that's where complexity thinking and systems analysis of the interdependence of different factors and actors that affect our efforts to change the SDGs and therefore need to be evaluated. Michael it was very much onto this early on. I remember my first encounter with him was reading his book Real World Evaluation, and then attending a workshop of his at the American Evaluation Association. And as the title of the book implies, it looks very carefully at some of the real-world complications for evaluators. One of his more recent books, dealing with complexity and development evaluation, takes it even farther in my head and outlines some ways to grapple with these challenges. Mixed methods, as he said. And it's nice to see him using triangulation, not just triangulating your sources, but triangulating your methods and the way you analyze the data that you collect. The qualitative comparative analysis, as Michael said, that can be a whole presentation in itself. I just wanted to point out to the audience, if you're not aware of the website Better Evaluation, you can Google that, one word, Better Evaluation, and they have a web page on that website which summarizes over a dozen methods out there for evaluation, and QCA is one of them, so you can get a better overview on that. I work with the International Federation Red Cross Red Crescent, and as such, issues or concerns about the most vulnerable people is very important, and therefore it was nice to see the emphasis on gender responsive evaluation and also social exclusion and as Michael pointed out, the issue of undocumented people. And again, that's where triangulating not only our sources but our methods to probe and examine issues is very important. I think, I can go on. The PowerPoint slide will be shared, and you can get a summary, an eyeball summary of the presentation through the PowerPoint slides. But I think a lot of the value of this kind of forum is the questions that are asked and the answers that are provided, the dialogue. So I'm going to turn it back and let some of the questions, the good questions that have been sent in, be thrown at Michael, and we'll see what he has to say. Thank you.
Terrific. Thanks a lot, Scott. Great to have your perspective on some of these challenging questions. We have a number of questions and comments, and we can always take a few more. One of the first questions that was raised a little earlier was about communication. So the question of building into our evaluation designs plans for dissemination of the results. And we haven't said too much about that so far in this webinar. Interestingly, of course, it connects to the whole question of advocacy for evaluation. which is very much what's needed, and I think lies behind the IIED paper, the EVALSDG paper that Scott introduced just now. And indeed, EVALSDGs, one of the key roles that it is trying to play is to be an advocate for evaluation in the context of the SDGs. So one question there about dissemination, communication. Another question that popped up was about evaluability, and is there anything that we should be taking into account when we think about evaluability? And I think it relates to another question that was raised by Musarat, on which I interpret to be really about the unit of analysis. So we've got in the presentation a number of ideas about how to evaluate, but one of the questions is, what do we evaluate within the context of the SDGs? So let's look at those first of all, Michael, and I know more questions are coming in.
Thank you for some more very, very challenging questions. The issue of communication and dissemination is critical. A failure of most evaluations is they tend not to get very widely disseminated or used. So communication needs to come in during the implementation of the evaluation as well, of making sure you're hearing from a wider range of stakeholders and concerned groups. There's an interesting experience in a lot of countries. When I was working on housing programs in El Salvador, before you could do an evaluation in a community there, you were summoned by the community leaders and you were asked, how will this evaluation be useful to our community? And they said, if it's going to be useful, we will tell the community to give you all of the cooperation. If you can't convince us it's useful, we will tell people, if you ever come back here again, to throw stones at you and chase you out of the community for wasting our time. So just that, many evaluators think they have the right to go and collect information from whoever they want. They don't have to explain the purpose. So communication should be beginning in what are the questions, what are you going to collect, how are you going to collect it, but then disseminating the results. Many reports are disseminated in a standard format with lots of pages, lots of tables. You need to have different kinds of dissemination strategies for different audiences according to the level of literacy, according to the kind of communications that they like to receive. But also research has shown that at the higher levels, some people like to receive a brief bullet points. Others, when Robert McNamara was at the head of the World Bank, he let it be known if anybody put in the executive summary, he wouldn't read the report. He said, I'm perfectly capable of analyzing the tables myself. I don't want somebody else telling me what a regression coefficient means. So for some people, you have to have a short summary with bullet points. For other people, if you have a short summary with bullet points, you'll be sent out of the room. And some people like a written report, others like a verbal presentation. So many different kinds of communication strategies are important. But one of the key things is just widening the range of stakeholders to make sure that a lot of the people that you want to get this to are actually going to receive copies. And many governments are not very enthusiastic about that, or they say it would be difficult because we don't have the emails, we don't know how to send it to people. So widening the range of stakeholders is a challenge, but really thinking through your communication strategy, how is this message going to be received by and understood by different groups? And even a very, very basic thing, just think how many evaluation reports are never published in the local language. If you speak French or you speak English, it's great, but if you speak only Kiswahili or whatever, you may never even see the report in your language. And if you talk to evaluators, they spent $50,000 on doing statistical analysis, and then they say, we don't have a budget to translate the report. So some issues there. Evaluability is really critical. Evaluability includes, are you asking the right questions? Are the ways you're going to collect data Are these valid indicators? Can you collect the data? So many evaluations where people say that the Ministry of Education, for example, has told us they've got a great data set which has exactly the information we want. You don't have time to check on that. When you start the evaluation, you find that that data is not actually there, or it's not in the form you want, it's not very reliable, it doesn't ask the right questions. So evaluability analysis, are you asking the right questions? Can you collect the data? And just one thing which is really critical, this question of trajectories. So many evaluations, you won't be able to answer the questions because you're doing the evaluation too early. So there's a number of really critical things that need to come into the evaluability and analysis. We could go on to that, but it's something which often doesn't get addressed as much as it should. The other question, the unit of analysis, this is really challenging for the SDGs, which would like to evaluate issues at all different levels, different sectors. So, so a real challenge is just thinking, what is evaluation going to focus on in a particular country? You may have some guidelines that a certain number of the evaluations have to focus at the local level, at the grassroots level, and not just be collecting data through the Central Statistics Bureau. So there's no clear answer to this, but it's important from time to time to do an assessment, to just look at what are the evaluations focusing on overall, what are some of the big gaps, the things that people said they were going to look at, for example, who is left behind. Is anybody actually looking at that in the evaluations? So just having a check from time to time, what are you actually evaluating? If these evaluations worked out perfectly, would they be answering what you consider the priority questions? And very often you find that they're not. This gets into political dynamics and whose voice counts and so on, but it is very important. And so, unfortunately, so there's no simple answer to what is the unit of analysis. But it shouldn't just be defined by the national government. There's lots of other actors which have to have a voice in what you're going to evaluate. So.
Great, thanks, Michael. We're moving towards the end of the presentation now, but a couple of comments and questions have come in trying to look at the links between monitoring and evaluation. So Laura Gagliardione has asked whether there's a link, possibly a middle path between monitoring and evaluation, and trying to build a bridge between the two. Do you have any thoughts on that, Michael? A related comment here is concerning the evaluation process. How can we use? Sorry, it's on communication rather than on M&E. How can we make the evaluation process itself an important part of communicating around evaluation? And one of the thoughts that occurred to me, in fact, actually related, the reason I was thinking of these two things together is that, of course, the approach of developmental evaluation is an interesting way of trying to square that particular circle. We, I think, have exhausted our audience, so you might want to wrap up those questions with a few concluding remarks, Mike. Thanks.
Thank you. The issue of the links between monitoring and evaluation is a very challenging one and much debated. A lot of organisations, the two functions are completely separate. They don't even talk to each other. Many evaluators never look at monitoring data, but monitoring should be an integral part of evaluation, because a good evaluation is not just looking at outcome, it's looking at processes of what has actually changed during the implementation of a project. Projects influence the target groups, and target groups influence the project. So the concepts of emergence, dynamic monitoring requires a much closer link. And this is debated. Some people say evaluation has to be objective, mustn't look at monitoring data. So there's a lot of ideological and political issues involved, but good monitoring data should be one of the key inputs to the evaluation. And this relates to the second question of the using the process of evaluation as a form of communication. One of the things that you should do with monitoring is have a dynamic monitoring where you're identifying issues, investigating them, and providing feedback to decision makers and stakeholders on how to be adapting the program implementation to the findings from the evaluation. So this is starting to build findings from the monitoring. So this is beginning to build some linkages between monitoring, moving quickly into these broader questions, but the providing feedback to different stakeholders as a program evolves is an interesting question. Many people who consider themselves pure evaluators say you mustn't do that because it builds in bias. If you're talking to the program you're evaluating, then the program will change and your evaluation is no longer objective. So that's an issue, particularly for independent evaluation offices where they're supposed to maintain objectivity. So there are two very distinct things you're doing with monitoring evaluation. One is formative, where you're trying to improve the implementation and the outcomes of the program, and the other is accountability, where you come in at the end and say it's too late to do anything about it, but we found all of these things which were problems during the program implementation. So getting that balance is a difficult one, and developmental evaluation is on the formative evaluation end of the spectrum. So it's an interesting and a very difficult question. A lot of evaluators would like to be giving feedback to the project manager when you find out things, so you can start making changes. But then, what does this do to the objectivity of your evaluation? So it depends very clearly on what your mandate is, and not confusing the two. So I'll stop there because of the time, and just a few very quick concluding remarks, which Scott already made quite a few of these. The SDGs open up a completely new world of evaluation, asking new questions, much broader, much longer term issues to be looked at, introducing a whole range of new evaluation issues of complexity, emergence, identifying who is being left out, looking at the intersectoral linkages. And so there's a range of new challenges. The evaluation tools do exist for addressing most of these questions, not necessarily perfectly, but we can move a long way. The challenge is bringing together the people with these different kinds of expertise into the design and implementation of the evaluations, which hasn't been done in the past and may not be done in the future. You very often bring in a consultant to design an evaluation, and she or he has their own ideas and only talks to a few people. Maybe they don't have time to broaden. So it's very common, there's great resentment in many countries that all of the local experts are excluded from the consultations on the design of the evaluation. So what kinds of organizational mechanisms and structures can be set up so you can draw upon the expertise which already exists in the countries to address these different questions? So I'm optimistic that we do have the tools to address these issues. One of my main concerns is whether the SDGs are really going to be committed to addressing evaluation. There are many people who say it would be great if you were in a university, but we're in the real world, we don't have the resources, let's just limit ourselves to monitoring. I think that's a real concern. If the world community can spend billions of dollars and say it doesn't really matter whether we can say whether it's achieved its objectives or not. So I think probably that's the main concern. If people really wanted to focus on evaluation, it can be done. It doesn't have to be super sophisticated and super expensive. There's lots of ways you can get some good approximations, but whether there's going to be a commitment to doing that or not, I'm sure a lot of people are going to be saying it would have been great to do that, but it was going to take too long, it was going to take too much money, and the donors really wanted us to make sure that their investments were going well. So I think that's probably the one biggest challenge. The tools are there if we set up a structure where we want to use them and where we really want to address some of these broader questions. So on a half optimistic, half pessimistic note I'll end there and wish you all good luck.
Marvelous, Michael. Thanks a lot. And really, you've, as I say, taken us on a wonderful tour of the evaluation landscape. Many issues, too many to summarize. But I think a number of key issues have emerged throughout. And perhaps the recurrent theme has been the political context within which evaluation everywhere and always takes place. We talk about no one being left behind, when we should perhaps be talking about those who are being pushed behind by political forces and kept behind by political forces. So we need to be thinking about this in our evaluation work. Equally, no evaluation left behind. Why is it that evaluation isn't being given priority? It's a political question. It's too easy an excuse. Ian Hopwood, I see on the sidebar there, has said, well, African countries are cash-strapped, they don't have resources for evaluation. But we know that very often there are considerable resources available, but they're not being devoted to effective monitoring or effective evaluation. And in the end, it comes back to a governance question, a political question about accountability. So one of the things that we're trying to do through EVALSDGs and through Eval partners more generally is to raise the profile of evaluation, trying to ask some difficult questions about why it is that evaluation isn't being used in the context of the SDGs more than it is, and trying to advocate with political leaders and others to think harder about evaluation, to understand what evaluation can do, and to create demand. One of the comments in the sidebar that popped up a minute ago is, well, shouldn't in the context of the SDGs, shouldn't evaluation be country-led? Indeed it should. And one of the things that Eval Partners is trying to do is to promote the development of strong national evaluation systems, which will inevitably, in the current period, be addressing aspects of the Agenda 2030. Anyway, we could go on forever, but we won't. We'll stop here. But one thing I would ask all of you listening, if you enjoyed this webinar and you found it useful, by all means send your comments, send your suggestions to Lavmore Murienge, who sent out the invitation for this webinar. Send messages to him concerning the topics for future webinars. And indeed, as we've mentioned already, many of the topics that Michael has touched on very, very briefly could take a whole day indeed, but certainly a whole webinar to explore in a little bit more depth. So big thanks to Michael, first of all, for a wonderful presentation. Thanks to Scott for very helpful remarks, and you blew up a storm of sidebar comments there, Scott. Obviously great interest in the points that you were raising. Warm thanks to Lovemore for making all the preparations and organization. We had some technical issues in UNICEF just shortly before the webinar, but pleased to say that mostly we got this resolved. So thanks to everybody, and I'm sure we'll be hearing more from Michael on evaluation and the SDGs and complexity and real-world evaluation in the weeks, months, and years to come. Thank you very much, Michael. Yeah. And thanks to all of you who joined.
We share the PowerPoint there.
Will be shared very soon. Bye for now. Good night.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.